Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And on behalf of our entire board, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy Monday to join us for a conversation about Florida's bats. And happy start of Bat Week to everyone. I'm joined today by my buddy, the endangered Florida bonneted bat. If you think he's as adorable as I do, you can grab one of these at Bat Conservation International's website. Couple of quick housekeeping items before we get going. Could you please double check to ensure that your microphone is muted and remains muted throughout the duration of our time together today? The exception is during the question and answer portion at the end of our conversation. If you have a question, you can use the raise your hand feature. I'll ask you to unmute. You can talk directly to our presenters, or if you prefer, you can drop your question in the chat and I can ask it for you. That option is super helpful if you have a question pop up during the presentation. You want to make sure you don't forget. I'm really excited to welcome and introduce two of FWC's bat experts. We're joined by Lisa Smith. She's a research associate for bats and small carnivores. I just also learned she is an expert on the coloring of Florida's bonneted bat. So if you have any questions about that, Lisa's the person to ask. Also joining us is Dr. Terry Doonan. He is FWC's Mammal Conservation Coordinator. And Terry, we're going to get started with you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Let me see if I get all these little bits and pieces right here. Share my screen, and I'm going to share this one, and then hopefully you're now seeing my presentation. Yes?
It might be taking a minute, but not yet.
It worked really well a minute ago.
It's a Monday. Maybe the computer's just taking a second.
Yeah. Well, I'll do it this way. Oh.
Here we go, Terry. It looks like it's coming on now.
All right. How's that?
Perfect.
All right, great. Well, thanks, everybody. Sorry for the delay. As Michelle said, Lisa and I are going to talk a little bit today about bats in Florida and bat conservation and some of the challenges that we're facing for bat conservation in Florida. Just as a little bit of background, some of you may not know a whole lot about bats. I want to try and give you some basic bat facts just to get you more familiar with what really unique, amazing animals these are. One of the big things is that it's the only true flying mammal. Flying squirrels glide, they don't really fly, but bats are capable of true flight. And that's unique enough that they're within their own order in mammals, the order Chiroptera. But they've been around for a long time. They've been in the fossil record for over 50 million years. And you know, we don't always think about how many bat species there are in the world, but there's over 1,400 species, and that represents about 20–25% of all the mammals in the world. Most of the bats that we have here in North America and in Florida are small, but there's a huge range in the size of bats, from wingspans from about 3 inches to over 6 feet for some of the larger fruit bats or flying foxes. And then associated with that is a big range in the weight, the overall size of the bats too. All of our bats here in Florida eat insects, they're insectivores, but bats in other parts of the world eat a range of other foods, from fruits and nectars. Some specialize on frogs and fish, and then most of you are probably familiar with vampire bats that eat blood. Bat biology is also pretty interesting. Everybody's familiar with the idea of bat wings, but perhaps not familiar with the idea that bats have the same bones in their arms and wings that we have in our arms and hands. If you want to imitate a bat, you can take your arms and extend them straight out and rotate your hands so that your thumbs are pointing up. And now your arms are effective bat wings. That first digit is our thumb. For bats, the first digit is that small claw that extends above the wing. And then the other bones, that would be our hands, in their case, help to support the wing. So Chiroptera actually means hand wing. That's where the name comes from. Bats have long lifespans, and you tend to think of small mammals as being very short-lived, but bats can live 10 to 20 years or more. And associated with that is a fairly slow reproductive rate. Female bats typically only have one pup every time they give birth. Some give birth to two, occasionally, rarely three. But it may not be every year that a female is giving birth. So, if there's some sort of catastrophic incident that really affects the population, it can take a long time for that population to recover from that incident. One of the other things that bats, it's kind of a myth about bats, is that they can't see well. But bats have good eyesight, and so they use their vision to help get around. But most of the time when they're flying, it's at night. They're typically nocturnal. You may see them just before dusk, but most of the time the bats won't be coming out until shortly after sunset, and then full night is when you're typically going to see most of the activity by bats. Echolocation is another really important feature of bat biology. Because bats are active at night when there's very little light, they've developed the ability to use sound to navigate in the environments where they live. So they create sounds, and then they listen for the echoes, the bounce back of the sounds that they make. And by doing that, then they can navigate through the forests or other places where they live. They can find prey, and they can communicate with each other as well. One of the interesting parts about this is that, similar to the way different species of birds have different calls, different species of bats make different kinds of calls as well. And using computer software and recording these ultrasonic sounds, we're able to begin to identify some of the species by the calls that they make. And the figure that you're seeing here is actually a call from an evening bat. The vertical axis is showing frequency, and the horizontal axis is showing time. So the blue symbols, the figure you're seeing there is individual bat calls. And so they start in a fairly high frequency, they're fairly quiet, and then they, over a short period of time, descend, they get lower, but at the same time, usually more intense. So kind of a sound. Again, other species have a different type of call, but we're able to use the differences to help us be able to monitor bat species. And it's been a real advantage because a lot of older methods for monitoring bats we're focused on actually trapping them with mist nets or other things, and you don't always catch all the bats that are in an area at a given time. So acoustic monitoring has enabled us to be much more thorough in understanding what bats are present in any one place and time. In Florida, we have 13 resident bat species, and of these, the ones you see within the red boxes here are species that occur in small groups or colonies. And those groups can range in size from a few individuals for species like the Rafinesque big-eared bat or the tricolored bat in the upper right, to colonies of thousands of individuals for species like the Brazilian free-tailed bat or the Southeastern Myotis in the middle of the upper row there. But that's different than species that you see outlined in the blue box. But these are called tree bats, and they roost almost exclusively in the foliage of trees, and they roost individually by themselves. So it doesn't mean that the other species don't roost in trees. It just means that the tree bats only roost in trees, whereas species like the Southeastern Myotis or the tricolored bat may roost in trees sometimes, but may also roost in structures such as caves. And we're finding that they'll also roost in gaps in concrete in bridges or culverts under the road. So some differences in the types of places that the bats will choose to roost and in the numbers of bats that you may find in any single roost. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission at this point has a number of bat conservation projects that are going on right now. Most of these we're able to do with external funding. Without external funding from grants or other sources, we probably wouldn't be able to do most of these. Our long-term bat monitoring program is one project. I'll talk a little bit about that. And our winter cave and culvert monitoring and white nose syndrome surveillance are two other projects that Lisa is going to talk more about. Also talk a little bit about our bonneted bat work and our outreach activities that are supported in part by support from the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. I also wanted to mention the Florida Bat Working Group. FWC staff are active members in the Bat Working Group, but it's not directly affiliated with FWC. It's an organization that anyone can join to learn more about bats, get involved in bat conservation. If you're interested in learning more about the Bat Working Group, you can go to that URL at the bottom, or you can Google Florida Bat Working Group and it'll take you to the website. Our long-term bat monitoring program is one project that we've had going on now for a little over 3 years. The goal for this is to begin to collect background data, baseline data on bat populations across the state. And the emphasis for this is on acoustic monitoring, again, because you can do it in a way, you can be fairly systematic and you can do it across sites, and you have more assurance that if bats are present, you're likely to record them. The basis for this is a grid of 10-kilometer squared cells, and this grid has been laid out across all of North America by North American Bat Monitoring Program to help standardize bat monitoring across North America. And we've adopted that in here in Florida for this project. And the grid cells that you're seeing in this map, those that are pink are representing the cells where we're conducting quarterly monitoring, and the blue are where we're doing monitoring annually. Our preference is to do quarterly monitoring so that we learn more about how bats are changing in terms of the numbers in any given area and from one season to the next, perhaps learn more about how they're using habitat. But at least we want to try and get data annually in as many places as possible so that we have a long-term idea about trends in numbers within different bat species. One of the nice things about the acoustic monitoring is that people who don't have a lot of experience with bat monitoring are still able to contribute by taking the acoustic detectors and deploying those out in the field. And so at this point, we've been able to get 73 people from 22 different organizations involved in assisting with bat monitoring. So we're hopeful that by opening it up to other people, we'll get more people to be interested in bats and bat conservation as we go forward. One of the challenges, though, for acoustic monitoring is the amount of data that it generates. As an example, in 1 year, we collected over 285,000 bat calls recorded. And then the problem is managing those. You know, over 3 years now, we have over 6 terabytes of data that we're managing. And so that means not only getting it from the detector back to the office, but then once we're in the office, making sure that it's backed up safely so that in case one computer fails or something like that, we don't lose the data. But it just gets to be a challenge when you're dealing with those large amounts of data. But again, the advantage, like I said, is that a lot of people can get involved. And for that reason, we're hoping to be able to start a volunteer program to engage more of the people who aren't biologists in doing some of this work starting in 2023. I wanted to show you just a couple examples of what the data look like that we've been collecting from the bat monitoring program. The pie chart that you see on the left there is showing bats in terms of the proportion of all the calls that we've recorded over the 3 years that we have data. And each one of the sections of the chart there is representing a species or a species group. So low frequency is a set of 3 species that are difficult to tell apart just from their calls. And that's the hoary bat, northern yellow bat, and the big brown bat. So we typically just call those the low frequency species. And then in the upper right, the label lazy is 2 other species, the eastern red bat and the Seminole bat, that are also difficult to tell apart. The other major sections of that pie chart, Myo is the Southeastern Myotis, Pizu is the tricolored bat, and Tabor is the Brazilian free-tailed bat. This was a little bit surprising to us just to see these proportions this way, because although Brazilian free-tailed bat is one of the most abundant bats in Florida, we have concerns about the decline of the tricolored bat as a result of white nose syndrome impacts. and we're not sure, we hadn't been sure about the status of the Southeastern Myotis. So it was pretty interesting for us to be able to see of the data that we recorded, such high proportions were those two species. The bar chart on the right is showing you basically the same data set in a slightly different way. And what you're seeing here is the average number of call files that are recorded by one detector in one night. And that's over 3 different years. So blue is 2019, gray is 2020, and black is 2021. And you see a little bit similar distribution in terms of which species were most frequently recorded. And it's nice to see that of all the data that we've recorded, we're seeing similar patterns from individual detectors on average. FWC has also been actively involved in Florida bonneted bat conservation for a while now. And in part, FWC's work on bonneted bat conservation has been possible because of support from the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. So thank you for that. The bonneted bat is the only bat in Florida that's found nowhere else. It's endemic to Florida. And the map in the red symbol, the red polygon there on the map shows the distribution of the Florida bonneted bat in South and South Central Florida. They get their name bonneted because of the way the ears look. Some people thought it was somewhat like a bonnet, and so the name sort of stuck. Bonneted bat is the largest bat in Florida, and the photo there is showing you a bonneted bat on the left and a Brazilian free-tailed bat on the right. And Brazilian free-tailed bat is typical of the size of bats that we have in Florida. You know, my hand is about 3 inches across, and most all of our bats, except for the bonneted bat, are 3 inches head and body length or smaller. And so really small animals. But again, you can see just how much bigger the bonneted bats are than most of the other bats in Florida. One thing you can see too is that both of these species are members of the free-tailed bat family. So what that means is if you look at the tail membrane, you can see that it doesn't come all the way down to the tip of the tail. So the tail is free of the membrane, whereas in many of the other species, that tail membrane will come all the way down. So when we talk about free-tailed bats, that's what that term means. And these are not migratory. The bonneted bats are not migratory. They're spending all their time within the range in South Florida. One of the most important projects that FWC has been involved with is the long-term mark recapture study of Florida bonneted bats on the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area near Punta Gorda. And the map, that red dot there, is showing you the approximate location of Babcock Webb. The aerial photo is showing locations of bat houses on Babcock Webb. And the photos there are showing you what those bat houses look like. And these have been the core of this study, because we've been able to monitor bats within these bat houses. On each pole, there's 2 bat houses, which are back to back. And then at the bottom, that black box that you see is actually a pit tag recorder. It electronically records when bats that have been tagged with pit tags go in and out of the bat houses. And on the bottom, you see the pit tags. Those are placed under the skin of the bat as a marker. So you don't have to worry about whether the tag is, there's no battery, it's not going to run out of battery, and it can be just passively recorded as they go in and out of these bat houses then. So these bat houses have been instrumental in being able to learn a lot more about the reproductive system for the bonneted bats, about their social structure, and about how and where they forage. Also been using radio collars and GPS collars to learn where they go when they leave the bat houses. So a combination of different tools. Like I said, it's been able to learn a lot about the bonneted bat through this project. There's a lot of challenges for bat conservation in Florida, and we're trying to address those as best we can. One is the challenge of disease from white nose syndrome. I said Lisa will be talking more about that. Another is loss of potential roost sites. Caves are important roost sites for some species, and in many cases, caves occur on private lands where there's not a guarantee that those will be protected going forward. Many private landowners are really great stewards of their property, but over time, as situations change in families, Sometimes family members decide they may or may not want to keep the land, and if the land is sold, we're never sure about whether or not those areas will be managed the same way. So we do have concerns about roost sites such as caves like this. And then habitat fragmentation is an issue for bats, as it is for a lot of other wildlife. And just to mean by saying habitat fragmentation, I'm just talking about as areas are developed, you get to have forests and wooded areas that are then cut up a little bit and separated by areas of development. Even areas like agricultural areas, as those are converted to other uses, bats lose the benefit of those areas. And we found that bats are an important predator of many of the pest species that attack agricultural crops. And so it's been a benefit for the people who are farming, raising the crops, but for the bats that are dependent upon some of those areas, that can also be a challenge for them if those areas are no longer available. You know, one of the biggest challenges is that people don't have a good understanding of bats. And that's what we want to be able to change, is change people's perceptions, so that when they look at bats, the first thing they're thinking about is, wow, that is a really cool animal. I'm really glad we have those. So hopefully we'll be able to continue work on that. As I mentioned, the status of the populations for many of these species really is not well known, and we're working to learn more about that as we go forward. Same is true for habitat use. Although we have general ideas about where bats occur or may occur, we don't always understand some of the specifics about what affects how bats use areas, whether it's change in type of woods that are present or other things. So we're trying to learn more about that. And there's emerging issues as well. Wind generating facilities have been one emerging issue. Bat populations, especially migratory bats like the hoary bat, are vulnerable to these large wind generating facilities, in part because they don't recognize those as a threat when they're flying. Climate change too is another emerging threat, and as the environment changes, the world in which the bats are living is changing, and they're having to adapt to it. So it is creating some challenges for them that way. All that to say that bats need help. They need friends. They need us. People like to say that bats are nature's superheroes, and in a lot of ways that's true. I talked about some of the pest control that they're doing for agricultural crops. But what's also been true is the idea that sometimes even superheroes like bats need superheroes to help them. And that's where we want to try and get more people involved in supporting bat conservation. A generous donation to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida is helping us to be able to be more effective in communicating, and is pushing us to explore how we can communicate better and what ways we can do that. One thing is that this donation enabled us to buy a new vehicle to replace the 20-year-old truck that we have been using for bat conservation. And we initially wanted to call it the Batmobile. And then we realized that's a trademark name. We can't use that one. So we thought, well, what else can we call it? And because we're actually buying a Ford Ranger, we thought, well, that's pretty neat. We can call it the Bat Ranger. You know, in stories, rangers are a group of people who tend to watch out for and protect other people. And so it seemed like it might be a good fit for bats and bat conservation. When we thought about this, we thought, you know, what kind of messages can we put on this truck? What can we get, what can we use to attract people's attention to learn more about bats? And we thought, well, you know, can we use something that's a little bit funny, a little bit humorous, to try and at least attract people's attention? And so one thing we're thinking about is an idea that's like the Bat Force. Can we say that the Bat Force is a group, it's an organization, it's within FWC and beyond, in partners as well, working together to conserve bats in Florida? And this graphic is just an early draft, but it's an example of the way we might be able to use something like that that's a little bit attention getting, to be able then to communicate some of the messages that we think are important. And that's what you see there as the objectives. You know, we want to be able to increase public appreciation for bats, promote bat conservation and bat conservation activities in Florida, and also have people recognize that FWC is an important bat conservation agency. going forward, we're looking forward to working more with the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida as we work to address many of these bat conservation issues. And we're hoping that this will be a long-term and a strong relationship with the foundation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Sure can.
All right, perfect. All right, so as they've said, I'm Lisa Smith. I work for FWC's research division, and I've been working with cave bats in Florida for almost 10 years now. So I want to talk to you about some of the work we've been doing in that time. But first, a lot of people don't even know that Florida has caves, and we estimate that Florida actually has about 600 air-filled caves. And these are in those kind of like dark blue areas on that map. So up in Marianna, Florida, about an hour west of Tallahassee, there's a good dense concentration of caves. And also kind of in the Gainesville, Ocala, Floral City area, there are caves a little more spread out than there is up in the Panhandle. And these caves are, some of them are quite small and dry, and some are very long and wet. And I think Florida's longest cave is actually 4 miles long. And in these caves, we have about 3 species of cave hibernators. So we have the tricolored bat, which is that smaller bat in the picture, and they actually weigh a little bit less than 2 pennies. And they are proposed for listing as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And that's very recent. And then we have the Southeastern Myotis, which is that darker brown bat that's a little bit bigger. And they're a species of greatest conservation need in Florida. And there's also the federally endangered gray bat. So when we head out to do work, these are the species we're looking for. And the reason we're really interested in cave bats is because of white nose syndrome. And this is a disease that was first detected in New York in 2006. And it's caused by a fungus that we call PD, or because I can't pronounce the first word. But it affects 12 species, 3 of which are endangered and 1 of which is threatened. And there's several others proposed for listing because of this disease. And pretty much what happens is the fungus grows a little white color over their nose and wings, and it causes them to arouse a lot during hibernation. So they deplete all their energy stores and they can starve to death during winter. And it also can damage their wing membranes. And the mortality varies by species and sites. So it can be as high as 90 to 100% of a colony. And we're not really sure how that's going to work in the South. Like areas like Florida, our winter is so short, and on most nights there is bugs available if bats need to go out and feed. So they think there may be some differences in the way bats are affected in the South, but so far other areas also in the South have experienced high levels of mortality. And a long time ago, they came up with an estimate of 6 million bats have died as a result of this disease. But by now they're working on new estimates. It's probably at least double. So as I said, it started in New York. You can see it kind of spreads out as all these counties have. These are all the areas that have white nose or the fungus that causes it. And it's now in 38 states in 8 Canadian provinces. And the fungus with no clinical signs of the disease is found in another 5 states. In Florida, luckily, is one of those states, so we have not detected this disease yet. So we're one of the few. But both Georgia and Alabama that neighbor us have that disease. So we're very concerned about our bats. So you're probably wondering, what are we doing to try to combat this disease? So first we wanted to monitor these bats, figure out where they are and kind of collect some baseline data on how they're doing. And then we want to conduct some surveillance for the disease so we know when it gets here. And then we also have been conducting research for the past 8 years now on different aspects of cave bat biology, which I'll talk about pretty soon. And we also do some education and protection. So back in 2014, we started the cave bat monitoring. And this was when I was pretty new with FWC. And since then, we have surveyed more than 160 caves in Florida. And these caves are on public and private land, so it wouldn't be possible without all of our great landowners to let us come out and wander through their caves and look at the bats. And they're great landowners that really care about their species that they have, and it's just wonderful people to work with. And when we do, we follow federal decontamination guidelines. So as you can see, the person in the picture there is wearing a white suit, and we wear these Tyvek suits so we don't accidentally transfer the fungus. If it's in a cave but we're not detecting it, you can move it. So we make sure we wear the Tyvek suits, and we also clean all our gear in between sites. And then we also follow protocol so we're not disturbing the bats, because it's a lot warmer here than it is up north. So our bats aren't quite as sleepy in winter as they are up north, and they can go in and use white lights, but because our bats arouse more easily, we use red lights. And then we try to be quiet and quick so we're not causing any extra arousals. All right, so pretty much we go in a cave, you can see this one here. We walk around and we look up in all the little formations, and we look up in all the little pits, and we work as a team so we don't miss any bats. And we count all the bats as we go. And then when we're done, we also take temperature measurements and some other physical measurements of the cave. In this cave, we had actually already surveyed this part of the cave, and we knew there wasn't bats, so we could use white light and not worry about disturbing anyone. And I just think that's one of our prettiest caves that's on private property. And what we found is tricolored bats were very widespread, but they occur in pretty small numbers. So these bats usually roost alone, like the guy in the bottom with the picture there, but sometimes they can occur in small clusters like those 6 bats there. And sometimes when they're in torpor, they actually collect water droplets on their body, so they're covered in dew. And interesting side note about clusters of bats is it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, we'll see the same cluster in caves from year to year, and they're always in the same spot, but the number of bats will kind of change. But it's kind of cool to go in and know you're going to get to see a bunch of bats in one specific spot. And anyways, we found these bats in over 100 of the 160 caves that we surveyed, but only 2 of these caves had over 100 bats. And both these caves are on Florida Park Service property and are protected. And unfortunately, one of those caves lost pretty much its entire colony a couple years ago when there was a really bad rainfall event, and the whole cave filled up with water, and they drowned. So now we only have 1 cave with over 100 tricolored bats in it. And overall, 8 caves contain more than 50% of the tricolored bat population. So it may seem like a small number, but most of Florida's caves, I think 80%, are pretty small, so shorter than 60 meters long. And they contain the other 50% of the bats. So cumulatively, those small caves are still important to our bat population. Then the other species we found a lot of are these Southeastern Myotis. You can kind of see them flying along in that cave, the video on the bottom. And if you see a bunch of dots in the background, that's actually a cluster of bats. So when they're in a cave, they like to roost in big groups, and they can fit 2,000 Southeastern Myotis in 1 square meter on the cave wall. So they really pack themselves in there. They like to stay really warm, and they stay pretty active in winter. So they'll go out and feed on nights where the weather is really nice. But we can also find them alone. But overall, we found their numbers to be pretty variable. They seem to leave the cave some years in winter, and some years they're in there. So we'll go from having like 30,000 bats in a cave, and the next year there might only be 1,000, and then the next year they'll all be back. So they seem to move out on the landscape, probably because there's less bugs, so it probably benefits them to spread out a little more during the winter. And last, I mentioned the gray bat earlier. So Florida makes up the southernmost extent of their range, and they're originally known to use only 2 caves during winter because they have very specific requirements for the caves they use. They use very cold caves in winter and very hot caves in summer. And unfortunately, we have not detected them since 2011, and we're not sure they're still in the state. And we think it's not all the caves they were using were protected, but we think maybe they came to Florida originally because their preferred caves were disturbed by people. And since they've been protected and there's been a lot of efforts to gate off their important caves, they may have returned back north to cooler caves that better suit their microclimate needs. So as part of the monitoring, we're looking at trends. We can't really look at trends of the Southeasterns from winter cave surveys very well, but we can look at the trends of tricolored bats. And these are especially important since they've been proposed for listing. And over the years, we've surveyed a different number of caves. So the first year we went kind of small and only did 28 caves, but in 2015 to 17, we surveyed up to 150 caves, usually the same caves over 3 years, just so we can kind of get an idea of the year-to-year variation. And what we saw, it's kind of hard to see from this because after we scaled back on the major surveys of 150 caves, we kind of targeted the more important bat caves. But if you look at the max count, we went from 2020 in our one Hibernacula winter all the way down to 50 this last year, and that is a big decline. And those bats are protected. So we're not really sure what's happening. So that generated some more questions that we're really interested in looking at. And we conducted a formal trend analysis, and this can take into account data for caves that weren't surveyed in every year and generate an overall trend for our population, which is, that's that little curved line there. And what you can see is we saw a very strong decrease, averaging 17% a year, or almost 70% over the course of the last 8 years. But it seems like they've kind of stabilized around 2018. So they're not, last couple of years, they've been pretty consistent, which is good. They're not declining anymore, but we hope they start to increase again. And we found that one of the things that probably impacts their numbers is the temperature. So when we do a winter survey in February and it's like 80 out and we're in t-shirts and it's hot, there's less bats in the cave to count. So that raised a lot of research questions for us that I'll talk about later. But overall, we don't know the reason for the decline. Besides temperature might kind of be impacting it, might be changing the roosting behavior. So they might be moving to other cooler caves we don't monitor, maybe in different states. They might be moving out into trees because they're like, hey, summertime, might as well go back to the habitat we use in summer. Could be indirect losses from white nose. So we know that sometimes bats decline for usually on average 3 years before the fungus that causes white nose is detected at a site further north. So it's possible we're experiencing those declines and we're just not detecting the disease. And if they have it, it could also impact their reproduction. If they survive winter, but they're in less good physical shape, they may not be able to carry a pup to term or raise one of the little bat pups so they can fly. But we haven't seen any sign of mortality, so we're not sure about that. And then it could be something where like it's completely unrelated to hibernation. So it could be habitat fragmentation or loss or chemical contaminants in the environment are causing them to decline, or it could be a combination of all these. So we're still trying to figure that out and see how we can work to combat that. Then the next step that we do is surveillance. So when we're in there doing a cave survey, we look at every bat and we look for that telltale white fungus growing on their nose or wings. And if we see it, one thing you can do is look at the wings, spread them out like in that second picture, and use a UVC light and see if it fluoresces orange. So if we handle any bats or we have any bats that look like they have something kind of weird on them, we can examine them that way. But our most common method for surveillance is to swab the bats. So we go in and rub a little Q-tip on their nose and their wings, and we submit that to the lab. And so far, all of our caves have come back as negative. And we mainly focus on our larger hibernaculas and caves that have a lot of human access because the fungus can be spread by people on their shoes or their clothing or cavers on their ropes. And so we want to make sure that that's not happening. And so far, we look good. All right, and then research. This is my favorite part. I'm going to go over a couple of the studies we've been doing lately. So one of the first things we did, especially when we were surveying all 150 caves a year, is we wanted to figure out what makes a good hibernacula. Like, why are they choosing these caves? And is this something we can target in our surveys or focus our protection efforts on? And mostly we found that bats like caves with a cooler temperature. And this is because it allows them to enter a deeper torpor so they can save more energy during hibernation. They also like caves with lots of passageways that were pretty long. And that's because during hibernation, bats like the temperature they may change, or the temperature where they are may change, and they can move within the cave to a site that has a temperature that's ideal for them. And then they also like caves with a single large entrance, and a single entrance can really impact the airflow. So if there's too much airflow, it can desiccate them during winter when they're not drinking. And they also like domes and solution holes. So like domes is a big domed room with like kind of a dome ceiling, and solution holes are kind of like smaller holes that go up to the ceiling. And these areas can trap heat. So again, they can provide a different temperature for bats to choose to roost at. And then we were wondering, where else do bats hibernate? So when we saw declines, we thought, hey, are they just leaving? Are they going out and hibernating somewhere else that we're not monitoring? So the first place we wanted to look at is culverts. And there's some, documentation that they're used in winter as a winter roost. They can be used as a maternity colony. Sometimes when people are doing work on manholes, they'll flip one over and find a colony. And it could be a bachelor roost. So, in the maternity season, all the lady bats get together and all the males have to go somewhere. And one of the reasons we really are interested in culverts is because of their association with white nose syndrome. Right now we know Georgia has white nose syndrome. And there's a big gap where there's no caves before you get to the caves in Florida. So we're like, are they moving between culverts, and can they spread the disease through, by following the highway corridor from culvert to culvert? And also, if we do get white nose, we want to know where our bats are, because it's really hard to treat bats in caves without impacting the sensitive cave fauna. But it's a lot easier to apply a treatment on a large scale to bats that are using culverts. So I know everyone thinks crawling under the road is really glamorous, but I'll let you know, spoiler alert, it's not. A little bit of a tight space, and that one culvert on the bottom, there's hardly any airspace, and if we're topping our waders, I'll tell you there are bats in there. Plus you got the cockroaches, you got spiders and cobwebs. My favorite, the cottonmouths and gators. They're always a fun surprise when you're crawling in a confined space. So after doing this for one winter season, I thought, hey, let's hire some younger people to do this. And so far, they've all survived. But we sent them out there, and they surveyed over 200 culverts in North Florida. So we focused on the areas in green there. So that's kind of like the same climate as our caves are. And we found tricolored bats in only 7 of the counties and about 16% of the culverts we surveyed. So it's a little less than some other states, but it's still kind of interesting. And in these culverts, we found them in the box culverts, we found them in the pipe culverts. They didn't have a strong preference for a certain type of culvert, but they did like culverts with an entrance that was farther from the road, probably because it seems more natural, like a cave. And these culverts had about 1 to 9 bats in them, and they were occupied mostly only in winter. So tricolored bats go out and roost in trees in the summertime. So they come into the culverts around mid-November. Their numbers kind of peak in late January, and then they're all pretty much gone by late March. And they usually roost alone, but they're cuter when they roost in clusters, so I have more pictures of that. And the other species we found in culverts a lot was Southeastern Myotis. And we found them in 29 of the counties, and about half the culverts we surveyed had at least 1 bat in them. Our largest colony has about 3,000 bats in them. This is a lot higher than other states are seeing. And they do use these culverts all year long. They are in lower abundance in the summertime, but there is occasionally maternity colonies in the culverts. But they seem to use them a lot in winter, probably because they're leaving the caves and spreading out to these sites and moving around a lot. So then we went back to our original hypothesis that maybe bats can move between culverts and spread PD from site to site into Florida. So we went out last winter and we put these little transmitters on 20 tricolored bats, and they're very, very small. So they only track bats for about 2 weeks. And they weigh less than 5% of their body weight. So we went out, we got the bats, we tagged them, and then we put them back in the culverts and we followed them to where they went. And we led us to do some weird things on the side of the road. And we showed up in weird places tracking bats around like downtown Gainesville. But what we found was they went to trees a lot more than we expected. We actually only had them move between culverts one time. So culverts are at a little of a disadvantage because the signal doesn't come out of them very well. But we feel like we checked all the culverts for their signal pretty well. And we found them in 27 trees. And it was kind of interesting that when they were in culverts, they would stay for more consecutive nights than they would if they were in trees that are moving more, probably because they are active more and foraging more. And the furthest they moved was more than 3 kilometers from their original site where we tagged them. And those are some examples of some of the tree roosts we had. So we had them in some pretty small sweet gum saplings, and we had them in some bigger cypress trees. And so if you're wondering where they are, I wonder if anybody can see the bat here, because we tried to visually confirm our tree that we found them in, and it is right there. So the bat is in that dead leaf clip lump, and you can see the antenna coming out where the arrow is pointing to. And we've tracked them to people's driveways. So if you want to help out bats, one of the things you can do is leave these dead leaf clusters, leave Spanish moss and like palm fronds, because bats will roost in those. And yeah, we tracked one to somebody who was a live oak over their driveway and it was roosting in the Spanish moss. And we asked for permission to show up every day with our antenna and see if our bat was still there. So they only had about 1/4 acre and they were supporting a tricolored bat. So that was pretty cool. And then also we do some education. So we recently went out to the Luby's annual bat festival and we had a table there where we could talk to people about bat conservation. And we, FWRI, the division I'm in, does a big, we call it Marine Quest, and we do a lot of the talks for school groups, and we made this like little bat cave and had kids do a bat survey so we could help teach them about white nose and not accidentally transmitting the fungus. And one of the things Terry's working on doing is using some of that money they got for the bat truck and to do more outreach and maybe make a portable bat cave, kind of like this, hopefully more durable and quicker to put up, that we can use at events to help spread information. And then we've also been able to get a grant to make these educational signs for some of the state parks that help teach people about white nose and what they can do. And we also have been able to get a grant to help with protection. So Florida Cavern State Park in Mariana got hit really hard by Hurricane Michael, and pretty much all their protective cave fencing came down. And so that included our biggest tricolored bat, Hibernacula. So look in the pictures, see if you can see the fence. It's all right if you can't, it's pretty hard to find. We were able to get a grant and help them replace the fencing to protect the bats, since it's hard for them to repair everything at once. So, but overall, our cave bats, despite everything we're doing, still need some help. So we need people to take good care when they're out caving, try not to disturb bats in winter. And there's still a lot of we don't know, and we're still doing research and trying to figure out how we can help them. But we do know white nose probably will get here at some point, and it's important to keep with the surveillance so we can be ready to act when it does get to the state. And it's also really important to have comprehensive monitoring. So as we said, we don't know if our tricolored bats are going outside. Clearly they are. In Myotis, they are very variable in winter, so they're hard to monitor. So we can use numbers that we get from the cave monitoring and collaborate with Terry's long-term bat monitoring program to have a better picture of what's happening in all the habitats across the state of Florida. And with that, we've had a lot of help over the years doing all these cave bat surveys and gotten a little muddy, and had a lot of help from landowners and the other employees at the Florida Forest Service and DEP, and it's just been a big effort to get everyone out to help. And we've done a lot of our funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do this research. So that's all I got.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you so much, Terry. We have time for some questions, and a few have come in over the chat. And Lisa, you addressed this a little bit, but both Julie and Angie were so Julie was asking about if there's communication, if you or BCI are going and talking to schools or other community groups, and it sounds like FWC and FWR are doing that work. So I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that, but related to that, Angie was asking if there's volunteer or other opportunities for citizens to help with bat projects.
We do some outreach events when we can, when we have time with somebody local, and we're trying to work with the Florida Bat Working Group to make that more accessible. But if nothing else, we can help like teachers and stuff get access to more bat related materials if we can't get there. And I think just for people helping out, I think right now the best opportunity, I think, is Terry's talk about how they're getting the long-term bat program to incorporate volunteers. So I'll let him talk about that.
Thanks. Yeah, we've been working with the FWC volunteer coordinators and have got most of the materials together to be able to have volunteers, organize volunteers to be able to find sites that are near them where they can assist. We're working with our Office of Information Technology, our website folks, and updating the website so that as part of this, then people can actually see on the website, you know, what have I done? What have other volunteers done? How does that fit in with everything else that's going on? So we're close to being able to start rolling that out and hoping that in 2023, we'll be able to do that. So I guess right now, the best answer is if you stand by for a little bit, we'll be ready for you.
Great, thank you both. And Lisa, you talked a little bit about people who have like Spanish moss and other things they can do that's bat friendly. Jeffrey was asking if you wanted to put up a bat house in his yard. You guys, does FWC have any resources or anywhere you could point him?
We have, if you want to do it yourself, we have plans that we can send you. And right now, our recommendation for the best design is for our rocket box style, which doesn't mean anything unless you go and you look at the plans. It doesn't really look like a rocket. It's just a long, skinny bat house versus a short, wide bat house. But those have been more effective. So we can send you plans for bat houses if you want to do it yourself. If you want to buy one, we can give you names of companies that we know will sell you a bat house, or there's places like the Luby Conservancy in Gainesville that will sell you the bat house, install the bat house. So we can give you a range of information.
And Jeffrey and anybody else, because I know we have some questions coming in. I want to respect everybody's time, and we're getting close to it. So if you have any follow-up questions or you want any additional information, feel free to send me an email. My email, you can respond to the email you got this morning with the link. My email is on our website, wildlifeflorida.org, and I can pass your questions along to Terry and Lisa, and so get you guys in touch. We had a question asking if there's been any studies on bat intelligence.
Not in Florida, but Lisa, I think it's correct to say that people are looking at that. They're studying behavior and that type of thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's the safest way. No, we're not working on that right now. But.
We had a question asking if mosquito control programs have any detrimental impact on bat populations.
Not directly in most cases. Mostly that's done at times when bats aren't active. And we don't have any data to indicate that there's been any direct negative impacts from the mosquito spraying to bat populations. But there's also, I think some of the state parks and some of the other conservation lands will work with mosquito spraying efforts to have that minimized within areas on the conservation lands. So I think that helps as well.
Great. Another question, do North American bats carry coronavirus?
No, not at this
point. That's an easy.
That's been one of those questions that's come up before, and as far as I know, the answer is no.
Great. Lisa, you mentioned, I think you were talking about Marine Quest. Did you also mention there's a Bat Fest, and if so, where, when, is it annual?
There is a bat festival at the Luby Bat Conservancy in Gainesville, and they just had it this weekend, but it's a lot of fun. They have a lot of fruit bats, and you can go walk through their houses and look at them. So next year around this time, if you're interested, it's really a fun opportunity.
Great. So leading into Bat Week is if you want to get interested next year, take a look at when Bat Week is. Great. Well, we're down to a couple minutes left. So unless we have any other questions come in, I wanted to just take a quick minute and thank everyone for taking time out of a busy Monday to start Bat Week with us and talk about bats. Special thanks, obviously, to Lisa and Terry for the work you did for your presentations and joining us. Terry mentioned, we do support FWC's bat work. If you make a donation on our website directly to our bat fund, that goes to that. We also have, if you're in the market for a new license plate, our Conserve Wildlife plate, we're able to do grants from that for bat work as well. So we now have a way to order your plate directly on our website. And then the other way you can help support our work is give us some feedback on how this went and what you would want us to talk to. I'm going to drop a link for the survey in the chat. So if you could just give us some feedback, that'd be really helpful. Lisa, Terry, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to say as we wrapped up.
For me, just thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, appreciate the interest, the questions from everybody. So thank you very much. This has been great.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I love talking about bats. Probably went on a little long, so
you were great. No, you were great. It's amazing that you had internet access at the back of that cave there. We're getting a lot of comments from people just saying thank you both for the great presentation. I'm sure those will come in. And again, if folks have questions that you're sitting here thinking about bats and something pops up, don't hesitate to send me an email. I can pass those along to our presenters. Well, I want to, just thank everyone again. I hope you enjoy the rest of Bat Week, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Thank you.